Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political analyst Al Spry. We're going to get a different take on LBJ, the presidency, with his chief domestic advisor, Joe Califano Jr.
He was there, next to the president, throughout all of the White House years of Lyndon Johnson. His book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, is quite the eye-opener, and we'll get his views on the current administration as well. Stay put. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And political analyst Al Spry. Great to be here, Reagan, on Tough TV 38, all over the place on stations throughout Florida, at radio stations across the state, from the Panhandle to the Keys. And we love to be on TV with you guys 3 times a week, Wednesdays, Saturdays and Sundays at 9 a.m. And, of course, all over the weekends on different stations. We thank you for your we thank you for listening. We appreciate the support that we get on this show. We got a great show for you today.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, let's start things off with the legislature, still in session.
Got your hand on your wallet?
We have some bills relating to guns and education. That's having a hearing this week. In the Senate Pre-K-12 Education Committee. The bill, SB 180, allows school boards and superintendents to appoint a person in each school to carry a concealed weapon. What are your thoughts on that, Reagan? I don't know if we want to militarize our schools.
I really don't. I'm afraid I got to be against that one. They're talking safety issues and all that. We have. Many schools have safety officers in them already. Off-duty cops, locally hired, who carry guns. I mean, this is being done.
And of course, interestingly enough, switching gears slightly, when you pass a bill, they always want to make improvements on it. Now there's a Senate Communications, Energy, and Public Utilities Committee taking up 4 bills related to texting while driving. SB 192, 246, 270, and 492. Right now, texting while driving is a secondary offense. Some senators want to make it more easily enforceable by allowing police to pull people over for texting. What do you think of that one? Is that giving too much? I mean, you could just kind of, even if you have your phone like there, how do you know if you're texting? Does it give too much power to the police to allow that? I don't know.
According to the National Safety Council, this texting and phone business now causes more deaths in traffic accidents than drunk drivers. It's a very serious problem. I recently drove across North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. I believe it's in South Carolina, and we were on a major interstate. Every few miles, electronic signboard that says, "Wait to text, it's the law." So obviously other states have stronger laws than we do about this. I just pay attention to the damn road and put the phone away or pull off the. If you have to get on the phone, pull off the road and use it. Do not try to be talking or texting when you could takes a tenth of a second to lose control of your car and kill somebody.
I'll put you down as neutral on that one.
Absolutely. We hit a button there.
Also, I like when we do that. Americans for Prosperity, which is the Koch brothers, goes after Senate President Andy Gardner over his openness to exploring Medicaid expansion in Florida.
Really?
The group said is launching a major grassroots and mail effort to educate Floridians, that means try to sway people, about which state senators are supporting Medicaid expansion. It would also released a mailer being sent to Gardner's Orlando-based district. AFP, Americans for Prosperity, said other senators would be hit with mail pieces as well. I guess this kind of goes along with the Obamacare expansion for Medicaid. We've heard this being bantered around for a while. What do you think is going to happen with it?
Well, we're approaching that point, I believe, where almost a majority of the states have gone along with it already. Of course, we have a couple of lawsuits pending, and much is going to depend on what the Supreme Court rules as to whether this goes forward. But should the Supreme Court come down the same way they did previously in a 5-4 ruling, I think ultimately it's going to make its way across the rest of the country.
And speaking of Medicaid, we're going to talk to one of the crafters of Medicaid legislation along with Lyndon Johnson, and that is Joseph Califano, Jr. We'll have him in the next segment, and we'll be able to ask him some questions about it.
Boy, he was the chief domestic advisor to Lyndon Johnson. First, he was working for Robert McNamara over at the Defense Department, and Johnson kind of stole him away from Bob McNamara. And he was beside Lyndon Johnson at the ranch in the White House. I mean, almost 24 hours a day on call, and we're going to get him to talk about that. It is an extremely personal view, and pro and con. He doesn't. There's no particular prejudice here. The Florida Roundtable will continue following these messages. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined on the long-distance phone at this point in the program by a gentleman that I think I certainly feel very privileged to have him as a guest this day. This is a man who the New York Times called Lyndon Johnson's Deputy President for Domestic Affairs. He also served as U.S. Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He was in the Defense Department with Robert McNamara. And we welcome to the Florida Roundtable Joseph A. Califano, Jr. And Mr. Califano, we're delighted to have you with us today.
Well, it's great to be with you, with both of you.
It's kind of interesting that we are interviewing you on the 50th anniversary of this right here.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
And that, as I understand it, Mr. Califano, took everybody off guard. You were with the president that very day, and you said to him, Mr. President, this speech doesn't have an ending.
Yes, it did take everyone off guard. The speech was one in which we were working on two aspects. One was a bombing pause to try and get the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table, and the other was to try and get a tax bill passed, which we had enormous difficulty doing and which we felt was essential for the economy. The president, about 3 days before he actually made the speech, in conversations with me and with another White House aide, Harry McPherson, who was also working on it, asked us whether we thought he should run again. Now, all during that year, a few months before it, when he would want to get programs and messages up to Congress to get them passed, the Great Society programs, he'd say, get the message up, get it up, because I may not run for re-election, I may not be here. And that afternoon when we were talking about it, we both said, no, you should run. He said, why? And we said, well, you're the only person that can get anything done. And he said, well, Congress and I have been like an old married couple. We've been rubbing against each other for the last 35 years, and we're a little tired of it. So we went off and did another draft of the speech, and then he took me at lunch the following day and said he was quite serious about not running. For the first time, I thought he might not run, really might not run. And then actually that Sunday morning we said, as you just mentioned, I said, Mr. President, there's no ending to this speech. He said, don't worry about it. And that was a signal to me that he was likely to announce that he wasn't going to run or say something about it. And then when he worked on it, the original draft of that paragraph was, I shall not seek and would not accept. And he changed the word would to will, which made it an even firmer commitment not to run. And then we knew that he was absolutely not going to run again. I was actually home physically at the time he gave the speech. And I remember sitting on the floor and watching television. And as soon as he started, I knew that was it.
Wow.
Number one reason why you think he didn't run, was it Vietnam? Of course, a lot of historians say that the Vietnam War just ground him down.
Well, I think there were several reasons. I think I don't think it ground him down. I think he felt, one, if he did something like that and the bombing force, he might be able to get the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to the table to negotiate. He was determined to end the war on his watch. And that was part of it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And he was divisive on the war, and he knew that. And the second thing was, he'd become very divisive on the issue of civil rights. And, that was probably more controversial. The Vietnam War got the television coverage, but in terms of the mail and the anger and the irritation, civil rights was a big, big problem. And he had become divisive on that, and he was worried about that. I think also Lady Bird particularly was worried about his health. Remember, he had a massive heart attack in 1955, and he worked every minute of his presidency, and she was worried about that. I think all of that entered into it. And actually, he did get the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. He may have had a deal. And then the Russians invaded Czechoslovakia, and that changed the whole tone. And then what we didn't know until right at the time was happening was that as he was getting close to a deal, and the Nixon people through Anna Chennault was telling the South Vietnamese, don't make a deal with this president. Wait for President Nixon. You, the South Vietnamese, will get a better deal with Nixon. And now we know that happened from NSA tapes of her conversations. So he never was able to close out with the North Vietnamese.
Let me ask you this. It has been said that when you went to work for Lyndon Johnson, essentially you surrendered your life, your privacy, everything.
I think he wanted you available every minute of the day. I mean, to give you a sense, in a period of 3.5 years, I had about, I had less than 2 weeks off. And when he couldn't find you, it really, got to him. Let me give you one example. I was there about a week or 10 days, and I had an office down the hall from from the Oval Office, and I had my own bathroom. One morning about 8 o'clock, the phone rang, and it was a POTUS line. We call it POTUS, President of the United States. This phone rang with no intermittent stops. It just rang. It continued to ring until it was answered. Mm-hmm. And I was in the bathroom. My secretary picked it up, and the president said, "Where is he?" And she said, "He's in the bathroom." He said, "Isn't there a phone in that bathroom?" And she said, "No, Mr. President." He said, "Put a phone in." So
did
I came
you have
out, and she said, told me what the president said. I said, "Forget about it."
That's funny.
Next day, same time, same place, 8 a.m. in the morning, and I was in the bathroom again. And he called, and she said, "Well, he's in the bathroom." And he said, "I told you to put a phone in there," and shouted at her. And then when I came out of the bathroom, there were 2 Army Signal Corps people there saying, "We're putting a phone in your bathroom." The president ordered it. It was there in an hour.
Wow. The stories go, Mr. Johnson could, I don't want to say infamous, but the temper. You said he yelled at your secretary.
He had enormous highs and enormous lows. Mostly he got angry at the problem. We had a saying in the White House. We used to say, you have to remember something, you work for Lyndon Johnson. You're never as good as he says you are when he praises you, and you're never as bad as he says you are when he gets angry at you for something. And so we had that. But, I'll give you an example. It could be a little thing. He was trying to reach me one day, and my son Joe, who was about 2 years old, had swallowed a bottle of aspirin. So I had rushed to Sibley Hospital in Washington, where they were pumping his stomach out. And the president was trying to get me. He finally found me there. And the first thing he said was, where the hell are you? What are you doing? Very irritated. Then I told him. And then he said, oh, I hope everything will be okay. And then he'd say, those damn pill bottles, he said, they're too easy to open. There should be a way so kids can't open them. And that led to the Child Safety Act, and that led to the pill bottles that I bet Al, you, and Reagan, and me, and a heck of a lot of people in Florida just can't open that easily anymore.
That's right. Yes, they are quite confounding. So yes, we could thank you and your son for that because of the pill bottle story. That's a great story.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, how would you compare the leadership of LBJ to the current occupant of the White House, and not only him but other presidents that have come since?
Well, look. Those years he was in office, you have to remember, we passed hundreds of laws, hundreds. I mean, I say we're living in LBJ's America today, in a new introduction to the book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, and I, remember, we passed Medicare and Medicaid. We passed the first aid to higher education. 60% of the kids in college today are on those grant, scholarship, loan, or work-study programs. We passed the first clean air, the first clean water, the first solid waste disposal laws, the first motor vehicle pollution laws. We passed, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which created all these public television and radio stations all over the country. We passed the Freedom of Information Act, which will certainly create some problems for Hillary Clinton over the next few months. We passed the National Endowments for the Arts and Humanities. I mean, in Florida alone, all over the country, there are hundreds of dance companies and theater companies and music companies and opera companies that were spawned or supported by those endowments. And that was the idea, and I'm sure there were scores of them in Florida. And the other thing, remember, during Johnson's presidency, the country was changing. It was morphing from the corner grocer and the local bank and the local retailer and the local pharmacist to these giant drugstore chains, these national banks, these big supermarkets. So we passed a score of consumer laws, truth in packaging, truth in lending, all kinds of food protection laws for meat, fish, and what have you. So it was an incredibly productive and active time. Now today, I think there's a vast difference between Lyndon Johnson and Barack Obama. Johnson loved politics. He loved and respected the people in Congress. He knew what they'd been through. He'd been in both the House and the Senate. And I think Barack Obama really doesn't relate to them. He seems to, they feel, many of them, that he's condescending to them.
Mr. Califano, we do have to pause. Hold that thought. We'll let you come back and finish that up, but unfortunately we have to stop here. We want to remind folks that they are listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. The book is The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years. It is a personal memoir of President Johnson's top domestic advisor, Joseph Califano, Jr. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll continue our conversation in a moment. From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area on Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Joseph A. Califano, Jr. He was President Johnson's top domestic advisor, the White House Years, his new book, The Triumph and well, it's not new. It is a updated re-release, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, from our friends at Touchstone Publishing, which is an imprint of Simon & Schuster. And Mr. Califano, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you both.
Now, Joe, if we could pick up that thread from where we left off in the last segment about Barack Obama and the Congress, if you could continue along that.
Well, I'm saying, LBJ, he knew everybody in Congress. Let me say, this country is a presidential nation. When you look at the Congress, you're talking about 535 members of the House and Senate. They come from different districts, different states, with constituents who have different economic interests, different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different views of what's important. So you need somebody that can really give them tremendous leadership, and the only person in this country that can do it is the president. Johnson understood that. He also understood what made them tick. I mean, what any congressman needed, whether it was an invitation to the White House, whether it was some local project or what have you, and just an example. And he understood how to make that clear. Frank Church was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he was from Idaho. And one day he kept talking to Johnson about, Walter Lippmann was the great columnist of that era. He was, a national figure, and Church kept saying to Johnson, Walter Lippmann says you should do this with de Gaulle, and Walter Lippmann says you should do this in Vietnam, and Walter Lippmann says this, and the communists, and what have you. And Johnson finally said to Church, he said, Frank, let me tell you something. The next time you want a dam on the Snake River, call up Walter Lippmann. So he understood that part of it, and he understood whether it was an invitation to a dinner or whatever people needed, what moved them, what made. He used to say that everybody's moved by love and fear, and the trick is to know the exact combination for each individual. He loved politics. I think President Obama is a different kind of person. He seems to be more distant, more intellectual, perhaps. He doesn't really relate to the members of Congress, even those in his own party. And most importantly, we don't have any trust in Washington today. The president doesn't trust Congress. He doesn't trust the Republicans. He doesn't trust the Tea Party. He doesn't even trust many of the Democrats. The members of Congress don't trust him. The governors don't trust the federal government. The federal government bureaucrats don't seem to trust the states. And that's an incredibly damaging thing for us. When I was there, you shook hands with a committee chairman. That was as good as a signed contract. You called a governor, and except for some of the southern governors, like Wallace, who was a real problem, of course. But you called a governor and came to some arrangement on Medicaid or on some other program, and that was it. Everybody kept their word. That's not true today.
I think I think we're seeing that because I think people have changed in a lot of ways.
Well, people have changed. Look, we don't have 24-hour cable news with one channel on the left and one channel on the right, and we don't have. We also had a booming economy in those years. People forget that. I mean, unemployment went down to about 3.4%. That's unthinkable today. So, Johnson used to say, if we can get the economy going, that'll take care of about 75% of the people in the country. They'll get their fair share of it. And then the other people really fall into two groups. I mean, one of the people that just need help, the very old, the very sick, and they need resources, or Medicare or Medicaid, Medicare, I should say, and then there's another group that basically wants what most of us get from a mother and father. They need an education, they need health care, they need a place to live, and if we give them that, and if we eliminate the discriminatory barriers, we'll make tremendous progress. And we were able to do a lot of that in those years. Now we've fallen back on some of that. You're right. People have changed. People are worried about jobs. We have a global economy in which people are paid a lot less in many foreign countries than they are in the United States for doing the very same work. So we're losing jobs to them, or our people are not getting wages increased. I think older people are nervous about Social Security and Medicare, and will they be there? But I still believe that real presidential leadership, real recognition that the president has to get involved with Congress and has to develop trust from all segments of society is very important.
If I might, Joe, one of the things that came clear to me in the book is what I might refer to as inclusivity. How many times I've read you recorded in this where the president would say to you, make sure that my friend Everett Dirksen is on board with this. The Republicans have got to be involved.
That's right. Every time you go to him with an idea, he'd say, how can we make this a bipartisan thing? How can we make this? And Dirksen, the relationship between Johnson and Dirksen was extraordinary. Dirksen was the minority leader in the Senate. Remember, we had a situation in which all of the committees in the Senate were chaired by Southern Democrats who were opposed not just to the civil rights bills, but to the Great Society legislation and the spending. And Johnson spent, first of all, they'd spend many evenings having drinks together, and I would note, as I point out in the book, for every drink Dirksen got, it was an ounce and a half of bourbon, and for every drink LBJ got, it was a half an ounce of scotch. And that was intentional. But he also, he knew Dirksen so well, and they, after the enormous victory Johnson had in 1964 in the election, Dirksen called him to congratulate him. And Johnson said, I wouldn't want to be here if you weren't going to be here with me, Everett Dirksen. And they talked. Dirksen said, well, I want to have I need to have some surgery, and I don't want to do it if you're going to have meetings of the leadership. And he said, I would never have a meeting without you. And where are you going to have your surgery? And Dirksen said, well, at Walter Reed. And Johnson said, isn't that marvelous, Everett? You and I can go to Walter Reed and get our medical care. We can do that for all the old people if we just pass Medicare. And Dirksen said, oh, I don't know, Mr. President. Before Dirksen could even finish the sentence, he said, and Everett, I'm going to have a Voting Rights Act this year. And he said, oh, I can't go with you on that. He said, well, I need you, Everett. I need you. And he finally said, Everett, you come with me on this Voting Rights Act, and 100 years from now, there will only be two people from the state of Illinois that Americans will remember, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. And there was a wonderful relationship between them.
That is absolutely a marvelous story, and I think, we don't. How often did we ever hear Barack Obama say, go and get the minority leader and get him in here? And you point out that Republican inclusiveness perhaps is a reason that we didn't see lawsuits against Medicare, that we only had one Republican who voted for Obamacare.
Well, I think that's right. And incidentally, on the Medicare is a good example because Johnson kept saying, we have to have Medicare and Medicaid. We have to have half the Republicans. And, we were all young Turks, and we'd say, well, don't give in on this, or don't give. And he said, we have to give some. We have to, because if we don't have the Republicans with us, they'll kill us in the appropriations committees. The Republican governors won't take Medicaid and run it, and their allies in the large corporations just won't help. That was very important. And he also said, he'd say, I want you to treat Everett Dirksen, the minority leader, the same way you treat Mike Mansfield, who was then the Senate majority leader. I want you to treat Jerry Ford, who was then the minority leader in the House, the same way you treat Speaker McCormick. Give them the same attention. Give them the same accommodations. And we did. Indeed, there were times when I used to think he was making me spend more time talking to Republicans than Democrats.
Joe, we do have to pause again along our network line here. Let us remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Joseph A. Califano, Jr. He has written a personal memoir by President Johnson's top domestic advisor. It is a reissue, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, from our friends at Touchstone Publishing, available at all the fine bookstores around Florida. We hope that you'll pick it up. Our conversation continues following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is Joseph A. Califano, Jr. His book, The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, a very personal memoir. This is a must-read for politicos, and we know we have lots of them along the network line. You get into this, you do not want to put it down. Touchstone Publishing, all the fine bookstores around Florida.
Joe, I'd like to turn to some criticism written in LBJ's time and then a book later on. What about a Texan Looks at Lyndon, which came out when you guys were doing your thing? What did Johnson think of that? Did he ever comment? What did you think of it when it came out?
Well, no, look, he had a lot of criticism. He got criticism in that, but nobody's perfect. Number two, I think Johnson was very focused. We all knew it was the poverty program. It was the civil rights legislation, and it was dealing with these vast changes I mentioned that were happening in the country, and he just kept us totally on that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll give you one. When he was criticized, we sent to Congress the biggest housing act in the history of the country, the '68 Housing Act, and to this day, and the Washington Post in their story criticized it. And Johnson said that morning, if I walked on the water across the Potomac, the Washington Post would say, Lyndon Johnson doesn't know how to swim.
And I want to also ask you about a book that you may or may not have heard. Last year we had Roger Stone on. You familiar with Roger?
Oh, God.
Roger Stone wrote a book where he was theorizing that LBJ was behind the JFK assassination. Any thoughts on that?
I think that was totally appalling and an outrageous book. I mean, I think that Johnson was not in any way involved in that, and it's a terrible thing. That book, I think, was a terrible thing, and I think the movie JFK, which indicated that, and the CIA was a terrible thing too. Johnson had nothing to do with that, and I think I think it was appalling.
There was an enmity between LBJ and RFK, especially after he became the senator from New York and announced he was going to run for president. That was one of President Johnson's unanswered questions, I guess. He did all of these marvelous programs that you have talked about, and yet he didn't seem to get the adulation that attached to the Kennedy family.
Very good point. I mean, there's no question. I mean, he and Robert Kennedy were both street fighters, and they were on the opposite sides of the street. They really they did not like each other. Johnson even thought, I think, when he was vice president, that Bobby Kennedy might have been taping him. I think that Johnson did. He was haunted by the Kennedys, no question about that, and he did feel he didn't get credit for what he did in the Great Society programs, and Kennedy never could have passed those programs. He's starting to get credit now, because he's not around to appreciate it.
I had just recently, Nancy Sinatra was on CBS television talking about her father, and she told this story, and I had never heard it before, that John Kennedy and his administration would not allow Sammy Davis Jr. to come to the inaugural because Sammy had married a white woman. And here's Nancy Sinatra telling a story on this supposed great liberal president.
Well, I think the reality is, remember, there's also in Caro's book the meeting in the Kennedy White House, in which the Kennedy brothers are worried about the politics of civil rights and how they deal with it, and Lyndon Johnson says, this is a moral issue, this is not a political issue. There was a vast difference, and there's also the story of, when Johnson was vice president, gave an incredible speech on civil rights at where Lincoln had given the Gettysburg Address, and walked into a club in Texas with a black secretary that he had, and which was a segregated club, and everyone was astonished, but nobody stopped him.
We've got a little less than 2 minutes, but I wanted to ask you, Martin Luther King, a very close relationship for most of his presidency, this new film about Selma, some discrepancies there.
Well, the Selma movie is just wrong. It has Johnson treating King with condescension and arguing with him, and I wrote a scathing column on that. It's inaccurate. Johnson and King were partners. The real story is that they did things together that they couldn't have done alone. I mean, Johnson asked King to find the worst place in the South where Negroes, that was the term in those days, had to vote, had to recite the Constitution to vote, and whites didn't, and go down there and get the leaders down there and get it on television, get it on the radio, get it in the pulpits. And he said, so that a guy driving a tractor will say that's not fair, and that'll help me shove through Congress what I'm going to do up here with the Voting Rights Act. The story is that they were partners, not that they were opposed to each other.
And, Mr. Califano, we're going to have to leave it on that note, but let me remind the folks again, the book is The Triumph and Tragedy of Lyndon Johnson, The White House Years, a personal memoir by President Johnson's top domestic advisor, Joseph A. Califano, Jr., from our friends at Touchstone Publishing, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. And, Joe, we certainly have enjoyed this conversation with you, and we'd like to invite you to come back and do it again sometime.
Well, thank you, and I have enjoyed it very much, being with the two of you, Al and Reagan. You're a great team, and I appreciate it.
Joseph A. Califano, Jr. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll have a brief closing thought following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks, and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Al, I got to tell you, I just thoroughly enjoyed that conversation with Joe Califano Jr. Wow.
Well, I wish we could have talked longer with Joe. He really,
We've
he
taken
really
the
was
network
interesting.
For several hours here. One quick point. One of the things that Lyndon Johnson used to like to do, he talked about him being close to people and liking people. He was a big man, very tall, very heavy, and he'd get in your face. If he's trying to make a point and get you onto his side, he'd reach over and grab you by your suit coat lapels and have his nose up against you. And if you still wouldn't go along with him, cut you off. No pictures, nothing. But he was great at intimidating people, and he used his size to that effect. But that's a story for another day. So.
All right, so Reagan, I want to talk about this Jeb Bush story. He praises this Indiana law that's been in the news lately, under attack as anti-gay and pro-discrimination. I took a look at the law. It is a pretty broadly written law that can be used possibly to discriminate against certain groups. Here's the quote from the former governor. I think Governor Pence has done the right thing, Bush said. Florida has a law like this. Bill Clinton signed a law like this at the federal level. This is simply allowing people of faith space to be able to express their beliefs, to be able to be people of conscience. I just think once the facts are established, people aren't going to see this as discriminatory at all. There is a difference, though, between this law and other laws. The other laws that were written along the lines of the Clinton law are between individuals and companies that are mediated by the federal government and so forth. This looks to be broad enough to be people against people, individuals against individuals. I think that's a difference here that needs to be ascribed.
And I think you're right. It opens the door to what could be a very slippery slope. That is for certain. Well, as long as we're talking about Jeb Bush for a moment here, the latest polling, of course, we're still a long ways away from it, but shows that Jeb Bush is the top choice among Republicans nationally. This is according to a new CBS News poll. 51% said that they would take him. Now, where I question this, Mike Huckabee comes in second. And
we're still early in the game.
Yeah, and he's not been a governor for a long time. He's not even living in Arkansas anymore. He's here in Florida now, for heaven's sake.
But he plays a heck of a bass guitar.
Yes, he does. Well, all right. Well, we want to say thank you for your time this day. We hope you enjoyed the conversation half as much as we did. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll be back next week.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Reagan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Reagan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email reagansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.